For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. You are on our daily evening show, The Gist, and I am Nitin Gokhale. So on The Gist tonight, I have Rear Admiral Sudharshan Shrikhande speaking to us on the Quad, or the four nations quadrilateral grouping as it is called, of India, Australia, Japan and the United States, that has gained some traction over the past couple of years. As observers of the Indo-Pacific, we are going to look at where has Quad reached and what are its prospects for the future. Admiral Shrikhande was formerly in the Indian Navy, as you can make out. He was chief of the Navy's intelligence, as well as also of concepts and doctrines in his career, amongst many other posts that he has held during his long and distinguished career in the Indian Navy. Welcome to this program, Sudarshan. I think Quad is something that is now gaining a lot of attention the world over. And you are someone who was posted in Australia as the defense attaché for India a long time ago, and have been in touch with the developments in the Indo-Pacific as well as among the Quad countries. So first up, what is your assessment of the Quad grouping of nations? Where have they reached as of now, and what are the future prospects?
Thank you, Nitin, for having me over. I would say that Quad is actually one of the most significant foreign policy, I would say basket of initiatives that has been taken in recent years by India and by others across, for benefits across the Indo-Pacific over a range of human security and human development issues.
Right.
Unlike anything that has happened in many ways. I think it is wrong to probably think of Quad as the Asian NATO, because the Quad in many ways is already shaping to be much of what United Nations does or wants to do in terms of human security and human development issues. Quad is also trying to do something about infrastructure building for not only for the four Quad members itself, but beyond. Other than that, there are issues like the vaccines, development, etc. All of these are actually helping humanity in a larger way across the Indo-Pacific, and therefore Quad has that appeal. So in many ways, Quad is like some of the things the European Union does, like some of the things OECD does, like some of the things many NGOs, international NGOs do, or the United Nations also does. So I don't think we sufficiently realize what a clever thing the Quad is. It also has the potential of becoming a security framework with some deterrent functions that will come up. It's not an Asian NATO. It need not be a NATO at all. It can provide some of the security aspects to beyond the Quad by just four democracies which span quite geographically the Indo-Pacific, to provide a framework in which we become some sort of a deterrent, a counterbalancing to China. And if Quad can help prevent that conflict with any of the nations in the Indo-Pacific vis-a-vis China, I think we are making progress.
Indeed, but as you know and you are well aware that China would like it to be called Asian NATO. They have described it as trying to build an Asian NATO. But that apart, I think the originator of this idea, Shinzo Abe, the late Prime Minister of Japan, had initially described Quad as the coalition of four democracies.
Yes.
I think that was a more apt description from what you have just mentioned. But he also mentioned of the security side in the Quad that can take place. But there are obviously differences of opinion as well as differences of approach between these four Quad countries, especially India has some reservations about making it a security-centered
Yes.
or security-related kind of a grouping of nations. What is your experience? Because you also, keep visiting these countries and talking to different people and think tanks and some serving people. So, what do you think is the either a dissonance or a resonance to the security aspects of Quad?
Okay. I think you put it well. There's both dissonance and resonance in Quad, and I think there is enough of elasticity and flexibility. And I'm using, I think, Mr. Kevin Rudd's expression. I think
in one of our programs,
conversation with your
yes,
group,
yeah.
where he talked that one of the clever things about the Quad is that it has the elasticity.
Right.
And you're also right that China has mentioned Quad as anti-China or against China,
right.
And none of the political leaders of the Quad have really, mentioned the Quad to be anti-China or something. And yet, the deterrent function can be seen perhaps in the way it sort of concerns China. China does not probably let any mention of Quad, go by without, labeling it as an Asian NATO or ganging up or anything of that sort. But the Quad is not a gang of four,
to use a Chinese expression.
It's a grouping of four,
yes.
Which is trying to.
And it's certainly not the sea foam as the Chinese had described in the earlier years.
Absolutely, it isn't. It is much deeper. Yeah. Certainly, once we mention the Indo-Pacific, the maritime environment has not preeminence, but certainly a lot of importance. After all, people live on land, and it is the nations and the peoples who matter, and that's where Quad, I think, encompasses everything, including now the recent initiatives that have been taken in the maritime domain in terms of monitoring illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing.
Sure.
In which many smaller countries across the Indo-Pacific are very concerned. Sometimes in India we do not realize how much of overfishing takes place in distant Pacific.
Yes.
But we are getting more and more attuned now to realizing and trying to do something about preventing some countries from literally making seafood only a memory for much of the world.
So that's very well put, yes.
That should not happen.
Over-exploitation is happening.
Over-exploitation in the high seas.
Right.
But even the high seas belong to, they are the great commons.
Sure.
They belong to all humanity. And you cannot say that we can, pretty well do everything beyond a nation's EZ, in the big gaps in the ocean. And therefore, things like monitoring illegal fishing, exchanging having better formats on maritime domain awareness, etc., have a great appeal and a utility, even in peacetime. And that's where I think the Quad initiatives are very important. The other aspect, I think, is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, very few steps have actually progressed so much in the last 2 or 3 years. For instance, there have been 2 leaders summits.
Right.
The foreign ministers have been meeting. You compare this to 2007 when, relatively not the senior most echelons of diplomats did not meet in Quad.
Not
the
at all.
echelon below
Yes.
met for a few years.
Right.
But since about 2014 or 15, it has slowly been upgraded. And today, we see now I think the foreign ministers are going to meet, and next year the political leadership it's going to meet for another summit. So I think great progress has been made, and I think this is not going to be an ice cream flavor of the month or the year. It is going to be something that will gather a lot of resonance over the decades, and the dissonance, as you mentioned, is likely to then subside. And we might find more Quad, more support for Quad beyond the Quad.
That's true. In fact, there are like-minded nations like Singapore, Indonesia.
Yes.
They might want to, be part of the Quad, and it might evolve like the say. It's not a correct analogy, but Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they started with 5 members or 6 members, then they got other members joining in, and then you had observer status for many nations.
Yes.
And there is a strong case for so many nations in the Indo-Pacific to become observers to begin with,
yes,
if nothing else. So, since the Quad also has a strong maritime component, and as a mariner by profession, if that is the correct word to use, do you think that the rules-based order that these four countries keep talking about is something that really annoys China? When you talk about rules-based order in Indo-Pacific, rules-based order in the Quad domain, what is it that these four countries look for in the rules-based order domain, really?
Yes. Here, of course, China highlights the dissonance about, say, the United States not having ratified the United Nations Convention. But it's not about whether you ratify or you ratify, but you may not ratify, but you generally adhere to everything or most things. And there are countries like China which have ratified, but which are bending the rules in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So naturally they try and belittle the aspect of rules-based order, or say that this is an artificial construct that is being imposed and being needlessly talked about. China is a great respecter of respects rules-based orders, but they are redefining the rules according to Chinese characteristics, which really should not be acceptable, and they are creating a lot of potential upsets. So therefore, it is important that in the maritime domain, the Quad countries develop these kind of cooperative measures which will help everybody across the Indo-Pacific.
That's right. In fact, that's a good thought, because there are now outside the Quad, but from the members of the Quad, there are smaller groupings that are emerging.
Yes.
Like now there is a talk of a trilateral between India, Australia and France, which regards itself as an Indian Ocean power anyway. I am talking about France. And if that comes in, that only strengthens Quad at the basic level. If France comes in there, because it's a maritime power, it's also got strengths in technology and defense. So, do you think such groupings, which again are based on democratic systems of different countries, would they help strengthen Quad?
Yes, I think they would. They would. And another way of looking at it is, there are nations who might, or there might be commentators who might highlight the differences, and there are differences. For instance, as is well known, Japan and the US have a treaty. Australia and the US have a treaty. Japan and Australia have a bilateral agreement, but then so we have a lot of bilateral agreements. We have trilateral agreements. We have trilateral, track 1, 1.5 or 2+2, maybe 3+3.
Sure.
Quad is certainly 4+4 or 4+4+4+4.
Yes, exactly.
in various sectors.
Yeah.
So these contradictions are not serious, and they have been part of statecraft all the time. I mean, some of the issues that our relationship with Russia, could be, overplayed as a contradiction, but I think all the three other Quad partners also understand that there are issues there.
Absolutely.
And therefore, they are not, in any way hugely detrimental to anything anybody wants. Likewise, India can make a good argument about contradictions between the other three members and, elsewhere in the world.
Yeah,
so we can live with the contradictions.
So I think even the Quad members, each of them have a different relationship with China, for instance.
Yes.
So India has a bilateral disagreement on, if I can use that word, in terms of the boundary settlement with China, or the boundary issue with China. Australia has had trade disputes, or even has been blowing hot and cold with China on the trade and supply chains. US also in a way is interdependent with China on many of the markets, or supplies from China, and so is China because of its export oriented economy. So that way there is no contradiction like you mentioned. But one of the other aspects in the security domain among the Quad countries is, I think you mentioned it very well somewhere, the fort and the fleet concept as far as the security aspects are concerned. Does that work in the Quad context, or how do you see it?
I mean, that's an important point, because I think it works everywhere, because we are, if at all we were ever divorced from the fort and the fleet, we probably weren't. One can argue that way, but in recent decades, and especially in the past few years, we see something that is defined, for our audience as multi-domain warfare, where 5 instruments of warfare, that is land, sea, air, cyber and space, all come together, and they have their independent roles, they have their sequential roles, but their true effectiveness is when they are woven together in whatever measures that are required in the strategic context or in the operational context or in the tactical context of warfare.
Sure.
So preparation for this is important, and that is one area where the Quad can go. So coming back to the fort and the fleet, all, the fleet, to describe in simpler terms, is all that is at sea, on the sea, or over the sea, which means integral naval aviation, etc. And the fort is all aviation, whether naval or air force or army, or cyber, space and land based instruments, air power itself, that works from the fort. That means from territory.
Territory, exactly.
And all of them, if they work together, then you have the fort and the fleet fighting, or at least deterring somebody else's fort and fleet.
Right.
So in this aspect, the term comes from something that was wrongly ascribed to Nelson as having said that a ship's a fool to fight a fort. Now, in Nelson's time, this made logic, because the fort could hold much greater guns.
They were fortified.
Much bigger caliber guns, which could be which could actually fire at greater ranges, and they could be more easily moved around, and they didn't roll and pitch.
The
way
unlike on the ships,
did. So certainly at that time, although Nelson, I don't think ever said it, he would have understood the logic of it. And yet forts were always important. We know from our own history,
of course,
how many forts Shivaji built or captured, and 1 or 2 forts that he lost in battle.
Absolutely.
So forts have always been important to sea power.
Correct.
And
they're like base, you can say,
it's a base for launching. So today, long range missiles, long range aircraft, cyber, space, all are sort of originate on the fort. So this part is very important, and in that I think it is, the exercise Malabar, for instance, which now has the Quad members. It is de facto, you can say, a Quad grouping, but we need not call it that way. It's perfectly all right to call it as the Malabar exercise, because Malabar exercise goes back a long way. Much before,
Quad was even a speck in anybody's eyes.
That's right. So otherwise quadrilateral was something we wrestled with in school geometry. But otherwise within the Quad now, many bilateral exercises are going on between 2 members, or trilateral and quadrilateral across domains. I think there is for instance an Indo-US exercise, army exercise that is planned in the near future.
In the Himalayas, very close to the China border.
So there are many such things going on, and we need to build multi-domain coherence and consonance at the strategic and operational levels. The tactical levels might follow depending on the context that they are required.
So in that context, moving away from the security aspect or the security domain, there is also the possibility and potential for 2 countries or 3 countries in the Quad itself to have cooperation on technology, on supply chain. The resilient supply chain concept that they're talking about, moving away from China. So one of the aspects that India wrestles with is the technology transfer in defense from the United States, which is a reluctant giver. Although they have a pact with Australia, but since you were in Australia back then and you would have had some experience, how's the relationship, the defense relationship between, say, Australia and US? And can Australia and India cooperate on some of these defense related projects, and can the US help in that?
I mean, that's a good proposition to take forward actually quite a bit. So I would say that bilaterally, say India and Japan can do some high technology defense R&D in a mutually beneficial way. India and Australia can do, and trilaterally India, Japan and Australia can do. The thing is that for Japan and Australia also, their volumetric requirements or quantitative requirements are small, and therefore if three nations combine to develop something together for each other, maybe make segments out of it and work on those and bring them all together. There is much that can be done. Each country has its strengths. They need to be combined. So here is one area where the word synergy might actually be relevant and correct.
Exactly.
To use. We need to exploit that.
Right.
So I feel some progress from what I can read in the media is taking place on this, but much more needs to be done, and we need to be careful of avoiding the cliche of low-hanging fruit, because as I mentioned somewhere that if you pluck the low-hanging fruit, then somebody is tempted to only take you to the orchard so that you can keep plucking more and more low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely.
No nation then ends up owning the orchard. And here is somewhere, as you mentioned,
yes,
trilaterally and quadrilaterally we can do something. But the US is far off. The US has far greater, technological, legislative controls that they have imposed on themselves, and which, arguably, many Americans feel are actually harming their interests.
Their own industry or their innovators.
Their innovators and their ability to share. So technology also has to be cooperatively shared. And I think in terms of technology, the Quad has taken steps in terms of, STEM, that is science, technology, engineering and mathematics, education initiatives, to do research in a lot of areas.
Absolutely.
And why not do research in the defense areas? Because when all is said and done, we should not forget that the S in QSD, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, stands for security.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I feel that preventing conflict is coming out winners in conflict, if we cannot deter conflict, is one of the biggest humanitarian assistance and disaster relief elements that Quad can provide, and that's how Quad began.
Exactly.
in
After the
2004.
tsunami, after the tsunami.
So it's another way of looking at conflict itself,
yes,
as a humanitarian disaster.
Absolutely, and prevention of that.
And prevention, that strength and cooperation is a good enabler to prevent a humanitarian disaster called conflict from affecting us.
Absolutely, we are seeing the outcome of that humanitarian disaster, if you want to describe conflict, as in Ukraine and Russia.
Yes.
So on that note, I think I must thank you, Sudharshan, for sparing your time when you are visiting Delhi. It's a pleasure always to listen to your views and your insights into matters defense and strategic affairs. That's all we have time for this time, but I'm sure we'll have more occasions to meet and discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. So viewers, you know where to reach us for your comments and feedback. We always come up with guests who are knowledgeable in their own domain, who have credibility in the views that they express. So do keep watching StratNewsGlobal. Our social media handles are all visible on the screen. Do follow them if you are not already doing it. And if you are doing it, spread the word amongst your friends, family, acquaintances, so that we get more interactions, more engagement with our audience. For the time being, it's goodbye.